On the mark!
That's it. Well, 70 years in a man's life.
That's a lot to try to get into a newsreel. It's a good shot, Thompson, but what it needs is an anchor.
Every 10 years or so over the last half-century, the world's most respected critics and/or filmmakers have been asked to draw up their list of the 100 best films ever made. Every 10 years or so, some new titles come in, while others fall by the wayside. But, and you can bet the mortgage on this, one film is always there, and more than that, it's always top of the list, and that film is Citizen Kane, by universal acclaim, the greatest movie of all time. Now, for a picture first released in 1941 and made by a first-time director, that is one hell of a reputation to live up to. And let's face it, if you belong to that generation which seems to believe that Star Wars is not only the best film ever made, but very possibly the first film ever made, you may not think it does. But for more than half a century, experts, not just critics and filmmakers, but media analysts and social historians, have maintained that Kane remains the greatest of them all. Now, why should that be so? Why should a picture now more than 60 years old still be required viewing not only in every reputable film school but for all aspiring movie makers? For the next hour, I'll be trying to answer that question with a detailed examination of the making of Citizen Kane.
Good. Rosebud, dead or alive.
If you're discussing Citizen Kane, you have to start with its remarkable creator, Orson Welles, born George Orson Welles in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 1915, and the younger of two brothers. His father was a well-to-do hotelier and part-time inventor, his mother a former concert pianist. Orson, by all accounts something of a prodigy, was his mother's favourite.
I was spoiled in a very strange way as a child, because everybody told me from the moment I was able to hear that I was absolutely marvelous. I never heard a discouraging word for years, you see. I didn't know what was ahead of me.
Well, what was ahead of him from childhood to his early 20s was a whole raft of contrasting experiences. His childhood, such as it was dominated by the adult world of which he was the centre. At 22, he formed his own repertory company, the Mercury Theatre, with which he produced, directed and acted for radio and the stage, and at the venerable age of 23, his innovative modern dress stage production of Julius Caesar landed him in heavy makeup on the cover of Time magazine. But what truly brought him to national attention in America was his radio adaptation of the H.G. Wells story, The War of the Worlds. On October 30th, 1938, Wells caused widespread panic by presenting a fictional Martian invasion as an eyewitness on-the-spot news report.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed a message that came in from Grover's Mill by telephone. Just one moment, please. At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill. Their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been informed that we have finally established communication with an eyewitness of the tragedy. The next voice you hear will be that of Professor Pearson, brought to you by direct wire. Professor Pearson.
Of the creatures in the rocket cylinder at Grover's Mill, I can give you no authoritative information, either as to their nature, their origin, or their purposes here on Earth. Of their destructive instruments...
Couldn't happen now, could it? But then, people listening to their radios truly believed that evil Martians had landed. All across America, households were plunged into terror, and literally thousands of people fled their homes to seek sanctuary. Where? I don't know. Where do you find refuge from rampaging Martians?
Of course, we are deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast.
You were aware of terror at the time you were giving this role? Were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. You know, we did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie of that kind, and I don't know that they did, particularly, and so I've given up. One doesn't believe in the radio audience much. You don't know that whether they're listening or not. You have no idea how many people are listening or what they're thinking. I had every hope that the people would be excited as they would be at a melodrama.
As a result of the terror he'd innocently caused, Welles was now a national figure, though not necessarily a popular one. After all, there must have been an awful lot of very red-faced people around, and inevitably this fame, notoriety, whatever, brought him to the attention of Hollywood, which loves nothing better than fame or notoriety. He, though, was a theatre man, and in the 1930s, theatre people were loftily uninterested in picture-making. But then George Schaefer, president of RKO Radio Pictures, dangled before him a contract so unusual that, to use a line borrowed from a later movie, it was an offer he couldn't refuse.
And this superb contract only happened because I didn't much want to make a movie. And I thought the only way I'd possibly make it would be without anybody interfering. So I asked for things nobody'd ever had, and nobody ever has had since.
For a major studio, and RKO, though not major, was still pretty major to agree such terms with an inexperienced 24-year-old made Welles the most envied figure in Hollywood. To an extent, he was ridiculed too, but jealousy often begets ridicule. Which film, though, was he going to make? His first idea was an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a difficult novel to film, as Francis Coppola was later to discover. Welles naturally saw himself as the powerful, enigmatic Kurtz, but his overall ideas were too extravagant for RKO's budget, so the project was frozen and put on hold. Next, Welles came up with another, less expensive and potentially more commercial project, a British spy thriller called The Smiler with a Knife. It would star Carole Lombard and go into production as soon as possible. Unfortunately, Lombard turned it down, and no suitable replacement being available, this too was dropped. By now, Welles had been in Hollywood for a year without doing anything except squandering RKO's money, and it began to look as though he would never fulfill his two-picture contract. So, possibly in some desperation, he looked around for another project worthy of his talents and RKO's faith in him, in the knowledge that this time he really could not afford to fail. The original idea for Citizen Kane grew out of a discussion between Orson Welles and the veteran screenwriter Herman Mankiewicz. It would be, they thought, about the rise and fall of a great public figure, a fictional US president perhaps, or an industrialist, or maybe someone like Howard Hughes. Finally, they decided it should be the story of a press baron, and it was Mankiewicz who suggested that the main character should be modelled on William Randolph Hearst, America's most powerful newspaper magnate. Now, there have been countless books and articles about the making of the film, probably the most famous being the Citizen Kane book by Pauline Kael. It was published in 1971 and was influential, certainly, but perhaps a touch dogmatic in its insistence that Welles had little or nothing to do with the writing of the screenplay. In the same way, other publications, for reasons best known to their authors, have sought to minimise his overall contribution to the movie. So, in an attempt to elicit the facts rather than the fantasies, let's now break Citizen Kane down into its component parts and try to discover just who was actually responsible for what. Mankiewicz knew both Hearst and his mistress, the beautiful but limited movie actress Marion Davies. He'd been a guest at the teetotal tycoon's ornate estate at San Simeon, a few hours' drive from Los Angeles, where his drinking habits had made him unpopular. He also knew a lot about Hearst, his good points, his bad points, and his eccentricities. And it was this knowledge that was to become the basis of Citizen Kane. Welles lacked experience as a screenwriter. He knew that himself. But Herman Mankiewicz, elder brother of the multi-Oscar-winning writer-director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, was an old hand. A former journalist and drama critic, he'd been in Hollywood since the mid-1920s, and as writer or co-writer had more than 24 screenplays to his credit. He was a man of great wit, but also an alcoholic, and because of that his career was in decline. In the 5 years before Citizen Kane, he'd only managed 2 screenplays, so working for Welles, first on radio scripts and now on this film project, represented a much-needed boost to his fortunes. His contract, however, was not with RKO, but with Wells's Mercury Theatre, and did not entitle him to a writing credit. This was normal in radio, but certainly not in the movies. Mankiewicz was well aware of that, but he still took the assignment, and while Welles was mounting the production, and also flying to and from New York for his weekly radio series, Mankiewicz was sent out of town, away from the temptations of bars and booze, to begin writing the first draft screenplay. As a precaution, Welles also sent his co-producer John Houseman along as both editor and minder. After 6 weeks, the first draft was delivered, and like all first drafts, was far too long. But the story was fine. Welles made a list of suggested changes and sent it back, whereupon, with input from Houseman and further ideas from Welles, Mankiewicz presented a second draft, collected his paycheck, and reported to MGM, where he had another assignment. For the next few weeks, he played no further part in the development of Citizen Kane. Instead, Welles himself took control of the third draft, made radical cuts, and added the famous breakfast montage. Incidentally, Welles reduced the breakfast sequence from 5 pages of script to 1.
You never should have married a newspaper man. They're worse than sailors. I absolutely adore you.
Do you know how long you kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes?
Yes.
Really, Charles. People will think...
What I tell them to think.
By cutting the screenplay, he reduced the potential budget by more than $300,000. Still not enough, though, to satisfy RKO. More cuts would have to be made. As the producer, Welles had to find ways of economizing, but first he brought Mankiewicz, now free of his MGM commitment, back on the payroll to do more rewrites. Matters weren't helped by the fact that RKO's legal department regarded much of the screenplay as being derogatory of Hearst. Some scenes, they said, had to go, but that meant others must be written to preserve continuity. Fortunately, however, the 5th and final draft was both approved by the legal department and sanctioned by George Schaefer, who also, incidentally, suggested that the title should be changed from American to Citizen Kane. Welles liked that idea and set about making the picture. What he didn't know was that he was about to have trouble with Mankiewicz, but that came later. Meanwhile, the director turned his attention to design and the way the film would look on screen. Probably no filmmaker appreciated the importance of the art director more than Welles did, which is why to this day Citizen Kane remains a textbook example of what art direction is all about. Welles naturally had specific ideas about the way his film should look, but RKO, suspicious of his extravagance, assigned unit art director Perry Ferguson to the project, not just to work with him, but also to keep a watchful eye on expenditure. As it happened, this apparently bureaucratic move on the studio's part turned out wholly to Welles' advantage. Perry Ferguson was not only a gifted art director, he was also an affable man and got along famously with Welles, who from the beginning wanted his film to look different from any other Hollywood movie and impressed this idea on every aspect of the production. He and Ferguson worked directly together for most of the time, and their association was perhaps the smoothest aspect of the whole production, one in which Welles certainly played a significant part. Evidence of this can be seen in the design of the Thatcher Library. Notice, for instance, the lighting effect in this scene. Now compare it with this set, designed by Welles himself for his 1937 New York stage production of Julius Caesar. The similarities are too obvious to ignore, but we can go back even further to 1934 when Welles made his first 16mm film, The Hearts of Age. Compare this early obscure image with this famous one from Citizen Kane. There are numerous examples of art and design throughout Citizen Kane that can be traced back to similar examples from Welles' professional past. Now, of course, any film as famous as Citizen Kane naturally attracts its share of myths and legends, and one of these is that Kane's Xanadu mansion was modelled on the castle in Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and was indeed created by former Disney artists on RKO's payroll. In fact, it was entirely the work of RKO matte artist Mario Larinaga, who had never worked for Disney, and was based not on Snow White, but on a combination of Hearst's estate at Saint-Simeon and Mont-Saint-Michel in France. And now look at this. It's often been said that Citizen Kane was the first film to have sets with ceilings. Well, that's not quite true. While Welles was preparing his film, he became friendly with John Ford, and to familiarise himself with the grammar of movie making, watched Ford's 1939 Western Stagecoach time and again. In doing so, he noticed that the sets in some of the interior scenes included ceilings. Ford explained that the reason was simply to introduce contrast. Much of the film, he said, was shot outdoors, and after looking at those wide open spaces and the vast expanse of sky, I wanted a change of mood whenever the passengers arrived at a way station, and the ceilings gave that much-needed indoor feeling. But on Citizen Kane, Welles used ceilings in a completely different way and for a more personal reason. He wanted to shoot certain scenes from a low angle to give the feeling of sitting not in a cinema, but in the first 10 rows of a theatre. This, he was told, would pose problems with both the mic boom and the camera, but he and Ferguson were already working on ways to get round such difficulties. Orson Welles was many things: temperamental, outspoken, autocratic, all of the above. But he was also positive in everything he did, and throughout the making of Citizen Kane, his every thought was, how can I make this picture different from, better than, other pictures? So from the start, he gave careful consideration to each aspect of the production: the screenplay, the art direction, and the casting, including himself in the title role. But the area which perhaps concerned him most was the one where he would need the most help: the photography. He drew up a list of the industry's leading cinematographers, and the name at the top was that of Gregg Toland. This was the man who'd worked with John Ford on The Grapes of Wrath and The Long Voyage Home, and with William Wyler on Dead End and Wuthering Heights, for which he'd won an Academy Award. Toland's experiments with lighting and optics and his beautifully balanced visuals had set new standards in cinematography. Fine, but would he be interested in working with a first-time director who was not all that popular in the industry? Welles got his answer before he'd even posed the question.
One day in the office they said, there's a man called Toland waiting to see you. And he was, of course, the leading cameraman. And he said, I want to make your picture. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Why? I don't know anything about movies. And he says, that's why I want to do it. He said, because I think if you're left as alone as much as possible, we're going to have a movie that looks different. I'm tired of working with people who know too much about it.
Welles's association with Gregg Toland was a match made in cinematic heaven. Like the director, Toland was a born exhibitionist and had an inbuilt compulsion to extend the boundaries of conventional feature film photography. At the time of Citizen Kane, he was under contract to Samuel Goldwyn Studios, but enjoyed the freedom to take outside commissions. And the Welles project was right up his street. Unfortunately, Welles had aroused the resentment of RKO's executives, many of whom felt that he was getting above himself in offering Toland a lucrative contract. So they stalled on the deal in the hope that the cinematographer would lose patience and take another job. But Toland was determined to stick with Welles, and in fact started work without a contract. What's more, he brought with him his own crew of assistants from the Goldwyn Studios, along with a truckload of special photographic equipment that would help him create a different look for Citizen Kane. All of which caused fury in RKO's front office, and memos were sent to George Schaefer in New York warning that Welles' extravagant ways would take the project way over budget.
I've never gone over schedule or over budget.
There is a myth in the film community, for example, that Orson is an unreliable director, that he is profligate. With no disrespect to directors like Mike Nichols and Michael Cimino and Spielberg and Coppola, Orson hasn't spent as much money in all the films he has made in his life as they have wasted in overage on any one film. And this is a simple statement of fact, and I dare say they would subscribe to it.
In fact, we were under budget on Kane and under schedule, but we did that by a trick because I said, I don't know anything about movies, so for about 10 days, I'm just going to shoot tests. And what we did was shoot Kane. We shot 10 days of Kane before we admitted we were actually shooting. But we would have been under schedule anyway.
The first of these so-called tests were held one weekend at 9:20 a.m. on Saturday, June the 29th, 1940, while the RKO executives were swanning around on the golf course or in the country club. Welles took over the studio's projection theatre, crammed in a bunch of actors, and shot the scene which, in the film, would follow the newsreel sequence. It was his first attempt at directing actors on screen. Toland handled the sequence by shooting straight into blazing arc lights, with the actors in silhouette. To cut down the glare, he applied a special coating to the camera lens. The result was that the stark contrast of bright lights and dark shadows heightened the effect of the dialogue.
How do you like it, boys? Well, 70 years in a man's life.
That's a lot to try to get into a newsreel.
That last line, emerging from the darkness, was spoken by Joseph Cotton, who played Kane's friend Leland in the film. Now, at this point, the newsreel itself had not actually been shot, so the cast were reacting to a blank screen. However, with this projection room scene, filming on Citizen Kane finally began. Welles had taken a gamble that his experiment would work, and it did. Because it was shot unofficially, without the knowledge of the front office or the union, and without a full team of lighting technicians and props, he was already under budget and certainly under schedule, which wasn't hard because, at this stage, there was no schedule. This then was the start of the Welles-Toland partnership, and what was to happen in the ensuing weeks would create cinematic history. Looking back to that summer of 1940, it's doubtful whether any other combination of director and cinematographer could have produced the images we now enjoy in Citizen Kane. Welles' insistence on universal focus throughout the movie was a challenge for Toland, but the director had his reasons for wanting everything in focus. All movies, he said, seem to be shot the same way. Foreground in focus, background out of focus. The eye doesn't see things that way. I want the audience to see everything as they would in life. And just to make things harder for Toland, Welles also went for long takes, which meant that the actors would have to deliver their lines as they would in a stage play without cuts or pickups. Wherefore Toland was compelled to choreograph his camera movements throughout an entire scene without enjoying the normal luxury of stopping to refocus. Well, this called for tremendous discipline from everyone: actors, lighting technicians, cameramen, and of course Welles, who as the director had to ensure that the scene was played at the right pace and without the need for edited intercuts. For this reason, he cast his own Mercury players, people who'd worked with him in both the theatre and on radio and knew him well. As for the length of the takes, consider this famous scene which runs for almost 4 minutes. Shot mainly in 2 camera setups, it opens with young Kane playing in the snow, then pulls back into the room, keeping the boy in clear view while his future is being discussed by his parents and his guardian-to-be. There's a great deal of movement here, as well as a lot of dialogue, yet every character and every item in the shot is in perfect focus throughout. 1 minute and 45 seconds in, as Kane's mother goes to the window, we have the first cut from the inside of the house to the outside. And now we're into the second setup.
I've arranged for a tutor to meet us in Chicago. I reported here with me, but...
Joe, looky, Mom! Better come inside, son.
Well, that's quite a snowman. Did you make it all by yourself, my lad? Charles, you almost hurt me. What's that under here? What's that to display with? What happened?
Again, the characters are perfectly framed, the camera movement smoothly choreographed, and the shot ends after almost 2 minutes with a dramatic cut to a close-up of the mother, the camera tilting down to an even more telling close-up of the young Kane, and then a dissolve. Let's remember that this was filmed in 1940. Even today, a shot like that would be difficult to achieve. It took Welles just under 4 months to shoot Citizen Kane, and in that time, apart from certain special effect and process shots, which we'll come to shortly, he directed around 573 individual camera setups. Toland worked ceaselessly to ensure that every scene offered the same high standard of universal focus throughout. Some scenes, which were deemed impossible, had to be achieved through technical trickery, something Toland generally sought to avoid. This sequence, showing Kane typing in left foreground with Leland and Bernstein in background right, posed too many lighting problems. So it was filmed in 2 sections. Welles, on the left, was shot first, with the right half of the frame in darkness, his arm and the column beyond being the dividing line. Then Joseph Cotton and all of the right-hand background were filmed with the left of the frame blacked out. Wells and Cotton spoke their dialogue not to each other, but to a mark. The two shots were later combined in an optical printer, a device that Toland loathed because it was a duplicating process which degraded the sharpness of the original picture. By giving the sets ceilings, Wells planned a variety of low-angle shots which would further distinguish Citizen Kane from all other films. To achieve these, and to the horror of RKO's executives, trenches were dug in the studio's floor. They gave the camera flexibility, but in turn created real problems for the sound engineers because there was no space for their mic booms. The late Kenneth Tynan once said everyone should see Citizen Kane at least twice, first to enjoy the film for its own sake, and then again to appreciate the pleasures of its soundtrack. Kane's soundtrack is indeed revolutionary. Wells was drawing up a whole new set of rules and knew there would be problems, but for every problem he was determined to find a solution. Where the sound engineers could not use mic booms, the difficulty was solved by covering ceilings with muslin to hide the microphones without obscuring the sound. Indeed, in this scene, the muslin ceilings allowed Wells to do something that would have been impossible with the customary mic boom. Here, a multitude of microphones was placed at strategic points above the set, so that all the sounds you hear, the foreground dialogue, the singing and the crowd noises, were recorded live and simultaneously.
I said, are we going to declare war on Spain or are we not? The Inquirer already has.
No one today in this age of digital multi-track recording would dream of doing something as complex as this in a single audio setup. That it works so well is due in some measure to Wells' experience as a radio producer and to the expertise of RKO's sound department, headed by James G. Stewart, who had also worked in radio before joining the studio. Of course, when you talk about the sound in Citizen Kane, it's impossible to ignore the contribution of Bernard Herrmann. Herrmann had been working with Wells since 1936 as resident musical director of the Mercury Theatre's radio shows. They were men of similar temperament, Herrmann being as much an autocrat with his musicians as Wells was with his actors, which made him the automatic choice to score Citizen Kane. Like Wells, Herrmann had been a child prodigy whose extraordinary talents flowered early and quickly earned him a considerable reputation in the music world. Citizen Kane, though, was his first film score, and in keeping with the rest of the picture, it was hailed as innovative in a variety of ways. Where most composers of the period used large orchestras to underscore dramatic subjects such as this, Herrmann composed for smaller musical combinations before building up to a larger orchestra for the operatic sequences that came later in the film. For the memorable opening sequence, as we move into the eerie twilight world of Kane's decaying pleasure dome Xanadu, Herrmann made effective use of low brass and woodwind. While for the flashback to Kane's childhood, which starts in the Thatcher Library, he used woodwind in a completely different way. The mood here is one of wistful curiosity blending into a lighter, happier reflection on the short-lived joys of childhood. Obviously, Herrmann was not responsible for all the music in the picture. Certain cues incorporated works by Chopin, Rossini and Handel, and there were other brief contributions from the RKO music library. In certain scenes, there's a bluesy jazz ballad composed by Charlie Barnett with lyrics by Haven Johnson. And at different stages, this recurring piece is performed both vocally and instrumentally. In this scene, it's played by a background piano. In conversation with the director, Peter Bogdanovich, Wells revealed that the piano player was in fact Nat King Cole. Wells had heard the King Cole trio play the song in a Hollywood nightclub and thought it would fit perfectly into the film, this being before Cole was known as a singer. Of course, most of the film's music was composed, orchestrated and conducted by Bernard Herrmann. One of the trickiest problems he had to solve was finding a convincing way of illustrating Susan Alexander's chaotic debut as an opera singer. Wells wanted the curtain to rise on an aria, but neither he nor Herman could find an opera that began in this way, so Herman composed his own opera, Salambo, especially for the film. The character of Susan, Kane's mistress, has a voice of sorts, but not a very good one. To make the scene convincing, Herman engaged a light lyric soprano and composed a vocal line that was above her natural range. By setting the vocal against a densely textured Strauss-like orchestration, he convincingly created the impression that Susan, the singer, was pitifully inadequate. Deservedly, Bernard Herrmann received an Oscar nomination for his work on Citizen Kane, but ironically lost out to himself, winning the Academy Award for his score, composed later that year, For All That Money Can Buy. The following year, he worked with Welles again on The Magnificent Ambersons, but had his name removed from the credits when RKO re-edited the film without the director's approval. He never worked with Welles again, but his score for Kane is regarded, along with his later work for Hitchcock, as some of the finest music in cinema history. Throughout his career, Orson Welles was a passionate believer in makeup as a natural part of an actor's performance, especially for himself. He disliked his own features, especially his nose, which gave him a cherubic appearance and made his face photograph in a flat, uninteresting way. To overcome this and the problem of making Kane age from a youthful 25 to an old man in his mid-70s, Welles hired a non-union makeup artist named Maurice Siderman, who, uncredited, had worked on such films as Mary of Scotland, Gunga Din and The Swiss Family Robinson. What the RKO front office demanded was that the young Kane should be handsome and dashing. Now, Welles was more than 6 feet tall, but already a touch overweight. Siderman, however, set out to give him the virile appearance of a Clark Gable or a Gary Cooper. The cherubic nose was the first thing to tackle. As Welles recalled in Peter Bogdanovich's book, I always had that terrible round moon face, and it was all faked up with fish skins and tucked under the hair, so I was just as made up as a young man as I was as an old man. I could hardly move for the corsets and the fish skin and everything else. Siderman made sculptures of Welles and the other characters at different stages in their lives. Over Welles's head, he would sew a plastic skull cover to carry a wig. Then he would apply plastic strips over the nose, chin and eye sockets. In those days, makeup was unsophisticated and in most cases unconvincing. For instance, wrinkles once applied were so restricting that the actor could neither smile nor frown. Siderman, however, invented a process that allowed flexibility and let the wrinkles come back into place and the jowls move in a natural manner, whatever the actor did. He applied a red plastic compound of his own devising to the face and covered it with liquid grease paint, adding the wig and false teeth and special contact lenses that made the eyes less bright. Welles himself added the final touch by mastering the walk and mannerisms of an old man. Kane's moustache was made up of separate tufts of hair and had to be convincing because it would figure in one of the most famous close-ups in cinema history. As the character aged, the make-up process took longer and longer, often as much as 6 or 7 hours. This meant that Welles had to arrive at the studio at 2:30 in the morning to be ready to start shooting at 9. His daily production conferences were held while he was in the make-up chair. Indeed, throughout the 3 months of shooting, he would sometimes work as many as 16 or 18 hours a day. Even injury couldn't stop him. In one scene, he fell and fractured a bone in his ankle, but undeterred, he shot around his own scenes and directed from a wheelchair until he could walk again with the help of a steel brace around his ankle. Well, maybe he could do all that because he was only 25, but what an achievement for a man of 25. Today, everyone knows about special effects, and what that usually means is CGI, computer-generated images. But in 1940, there were no such things as computers, and special effects was an umbrella term, incorporating a range of different devices supplied by various studio departments to create illusions on the screen. And these range from the work of matte artists and model makers to miniature sets and back projection, and from mechanical gadgets to the compositing of images in an optical printer. Today's special effects can often cost more than the cast, the director, the script and the sets put together, driving the budget of a $10 million movie up to $50 million and more. But in the 1940s, the object of special effects was to keep costs down. And because one of the priorities of RKO was that Welles must not exceed his budget, there were considerably more special effects in Citizen Kane than in the average Hollywood film of the time. Here are some of the ways by which Welles and his team saved money. Take this shot of the Daily Inquirer employees watching from a window as Kane arrives with his fiancée.
Emily Monroe Norton. She's the niece of the President of the United States.
President's niece, huh? Before he's through, she'll be a president's wife.
The window is the only part of the frame that was actually constructed. The building itself and all other surroundings were painted by a matte artist. The shooting script says that Kane's Xanadu is in Florida, overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. But this procession of cars with Kane and his guests heading for a picnic in one of the few location scenes was actually shot at Malibu in California. To simulate the Gulf Coast rather than the West Coast, most of the frame is painted out and the hills of Malibu are replaced by the flatter terrain and the vegetation of Florida. Such diverse visuals were combined in an optical printer using a system that had been employed since the early days of sound and had been pioneered by RKO's Linwood Dunn, seen here with the first optical printer he'd designed and built. Some of his earliest and most impressive work in this area was in the 1933 classic King Kong. One particularly fine example of the capabilities of the optical printer is this shot of Kane standing in the doorway at the far background of what appears to be a large and elaborate set. In fact, there was no set. This scene is composed of 3 separately photographed elements. In the centre background stands Kane, presented in an image reduction process known as miniature projection. The area around him is a matte painting, which includes a very convincing image of Kane's reflection on the floor, all of which saved an enormous amount of money on expensive construction. Throughout the film, there are numerous examples of special effects that still rate as among the best of that period. This is one of Gregg Toland's most inventive in-camera effects. Through a combination of flyaway sets and imaginative lighting, the camera moves from outside of the skylight to the inside of the El Rancho nightclub through a single flash of lightning. That worked beautifully. But there's one instance where the needs of director Welles clashed with technological limitations. Here we have a projected ocean background and a shrieking cockatoo as Susan walks across the set. But look carefully. An unintended print-through from the projected background shows in the cockatoo's eye just before it flies off. If Welles had not placed the bird so close to the camera, this wouldn't have happened. But he wanted the cockatoo to scream and fly away as a shock device to grab the audience's attention. This, though, was an isolated instance in a film whose special effects still pass muster and more to this day. In every sense, Orson Welles was a hands-on director. There was no aspect of the making of Kane in which he did not take a personal interest. But while this resulted in an outstanding film, it also meant that Welles himself wasn't always easy to cooperate with. For example, RKO wanted him to work with one of their senior editors, a veteran with long experience, who saw everything in the standard long shot, medium shot, close-up, etc. But Welles hadn't made his film in the traditional way, and the preponderance of long takes was not at all to the editor's liking. This was a partnership that was guaranteed not to work out, and it didn't. Happily, however, Welles eventually wound up with an editor in his 20s named Robert Wise, whose outlook was much more progressive. But even working with someone his own age, Welles was as mercurial as ever.
Working with him was never very long on an even keel. It was either up or down. Marvelously exciting, stimulating, maddening, frustrating. He could one moment be guilty of a piece of behavior that was so outrageous it'd make you want to tell him to go to hell and walk off the picture. And before you could do it, he'd come up with some idea so brilliant that it would literally have your mouth gaping open. And so you never walked, you stayed.
But if Welles was occasionally unpredictable and difficult, he was always disciplined. And then too, perhaps because of his experience in the theatre, and especially on radio, he'd developed a natural sense of pacing. Most directors shoot a scene from several angles, and then leave it to the editor to put it together. Most of Citizen Kane, however, was shot with a single camera, usually without covering footage such as close-ups and reaction shots. The long takes had their own built-in pacing and could not be tampered with. So it could be said that Robert Wise had a relatively easy job, anyway, as far as those long takes were concerned. But because of Gregg Toland's dislike of using the optical printer, some scenes were carefully planned right down to the smallest detail, and that called for the most meticulous editing, which was no easy task.
But it was very well planned. The whole continuity, so many of those very effective long dissolves from one sequence to another with one side of the frame kind of going out and the other coming in, those were all planned in the camera. Not shot in the camera, but planned to go that way. So I think it was very well laid out, very well planned.
All in all, Welles had produced, co-written, starred in and directed Citizen Kane and made a truly classic film. But it was the only time ever that a Hollywood studio gave him such artistic freedom. Why did it never happen again? Throughout the production and shooting of Kane, Welles behaved like a law unto himself. He insisted on a closed set, limited access to rushes, held control of the publicity, and generally concealed the film's connection with William Randolph Hearst. RKO's legal department was satisfied that there was nothing actionable in the script, but Welles did not want to go public with the subject matter until the film was completed. Inevitably, this attitude only increased the curiosity of the media, and eventually the Hearst connection became public. One paper said that the code of silence was broken by the actors. Other sources claimed it was the co-writer, Herman Mankiewicz, who spilled the beans. Whatever the truth of the matter, Mankiewicz, realizing the importance of Kane, was now asking for a screen credit. Welles reminded him that his contract with the Mercury Theatre did not entitle him to such a thing, but Mankiewicz was adamant. Thinking he was only after more money, Welles offered him a further $10,000 to keep quiet. After all, his RKO contract said that Welles alone was to be credited as writer. Mankiewicz, however, contacted the Screenwriters Guild to plead his case, claiming that he should be given sole writing credit. But because of his contract with the Mercury Theatre, a compromise was reached, and the credit was split. With that problem solved, Welles and RKO hoped that the film would be a commercial success. But by now, the Hearst connection had been revealed and developed into an insoluble problem. The Hollywood gossip columnist Luella Parsons, who by sheer coincidence, of course, worked for Hearst's papers, was furious with the film and its resemblance to her employer's life and loves. Whereupon Welles, in one of his less convincing moments, foolishly denied the Hearst connection.
The picture was about William Randolph Hearst and 2 or 3 other newspaper barons. But the picture was also about Orson. And a great deal of stuff in that picture was taken not only from Hearst's life, but from Orson's childhood, from Orson's life, and certain characteristics of Kane were characteristics of Orson rather than William Randolph Hearst.
In actual fact, there was nothing much in the film that Hearst personally could have had a legal complaint about. Welles had portrayed Kane as a basically rounded personality with virtues as well as faults, which faults were only magnified by his immense wealth. It was far more likely that Hearst resented the veiled references to Marion Davies and the way her professionally inept screen counterpart was presented.
I thought we were very unfair to Marion Davies because we had somebody very different in the place of Marion Davies, and it seemed to me to be something of a dirty trick, and does still strike me as being something of a dirty trick, what we did to her.
But if Hearst had no effective legal means of blocking the release of Citizen Kane, he had other ways of attacking it and its studio. For a start, he refused to give the movie any advertising space and would not allow his papers to review or even mention it. Furthermore, the army of writers and columnists he employed were quietly urged to blacken the name of Orson Welles in every way they possibly could. Indeed, at one point, it was said, he went even further.
I was lecturing in Buffalo, and after the lecture, I was with some people having dinner, and a waiter said, "There's a policeman wants to see you," and I turned white. I always feel guilty when policemen want to see me, and the cop turned out to be very nice. He said, "Don't go back to your hotel room." I said, "Why?" He said, "They've got an underage girl, undressed, and photographers waiting for you. It's a setup." So I didn't go back to my room that night. I just stayed up, took the plane in the morning. But that was as far as they were prepared to go. I would have gone to jail, of course. And they had the producers in Hollywood ready all together to pay RKO to burn the negative. It was nip and tuck, you know. Whether the negative would be burnt, the picture never shown.
In fact, the original negative was eventually burned in the early 1950s and under highly suspicious circumstances. Fortunately, a duplicate negative did exist, which is why we're still able to see Citizen Kane today. Although Hearst effectively ruined the film's commercial chances in 1941, it was a resounding critical success and hailed by many in the film industry as a masterpiece, which is why it received 9 Academy Award nominations: Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, Best Sound, Best Editing, and Best Music Score. But the only Oscar it received was for the screenplay, shared between Mankiewicz and Welles. So what went wrong? Variety claimed that block voting against Welles by screen extras, though why they should have cared remains obscure, robbed him of the Best Picture and Actor awards, while similar prejudices made their mark in the technical categories. Well, it's possible, but the threat of Hearst's wrath and that of its newspapers should not perhaps be discounted. Welles was only 25 when he made Citizen Kane his first feature film. He should have gone on to make many, many more, but the following year he and RKO parted company acrimoniously, and it was some years before he directed again. In a 45-year screen career covering some 90 films, he directed only a dozen commercially released movies, most of them in Europe. Whatever you feel about Citizen Kane and its place in the pantheon of movie classics, one thing I suggest is indisputable. It is and may always remain the greatest first film ever made. Perhaps if it hadn't been modelled on the vindictive William Randolph Hearst, the life and career of Orson Welles might have been very different. But that in itself leaves us with the question, how much real similarity was there between Hearst and Charles Foster Kane? I'll leave the last word to Orson Welles.
It was the opening night of Citizen Kane in San Francisco, and I found myself going to the top of the mark in the elevator with Mr. Hearst, and I introduced myself. This strange dinosaur, you know, he had ice-cold blue eyes and had a very high unicoid voice like that. And I said, Mr. Hearst, I didn't bother him with my father or any of that. I just said, I have some good tickets for the opening of Citizen Kane. Would you like to come? And he didn't answer. And I got off the elevator, thinking, as I still do, that if he had been Charles Foster Kane, he would have taken the tickets and gone.